It's a good question. The Constitution does not provide that the Attorney General can be elected. So if you wanted to do that, you would have to create a new provision of the Constitution and pass a constitutional amendment. The Founding Fathers, and you don't even need to necessarily have an Attorney General. The Constitution says that the Congress will create different cabinet departments, and so we've always had an Attorney General, but we used to have a War Department. It's not called the War Department anymore. Now we have the Defense Department. So those things have changed throughout the years. The Founding Fathers believed that the cabinet officers needed to answer to the President, and they wanted all executive functions to ultimately stop at the President's desk. And the reason they wanted that is so that the American people knew who they could hold responsible. The idea would be if you have an elected Attorney General, you have an elected President, if they're at loggerheads, you don't really have unity in the executive, and it doesn't make the administration work properly. But I agree with you. I think in this case with Attorney General Holder, he has really failed to do due diligence for a number of these cases, most conspicuously with the IRS abuses, and he's come to Congress and testified and not told the truth to Congress, the people's representatives. And so when you do that, I think you completely lose your standing and credibility. I've called on him to resign. Of course, he was held in contempt of Congress last Congress before I got here. And since all this has happened in the middle of the year, he's really started to maintain a lower profile, and I do fear that I think his main function is to serve as a political, to run political interference for the administration. That's obviously not what we want out of an Attorney General, but that's the way the system's set up right now. But it's an interesting question and a good one. Well, I appreciate that. It's interesting, since I've been up in Washington, the people who consider themselves to be the mature adults in the room, who understand how to govern, are basically the people who have gotten us to the point where we are right now, where we're $17+ trillion in debt. We have a fiscal future that is even worse than what we've had over the last several years, if you look at the projections. And people who want to reform Washington, like me, are constantly told, oh, that's just not the way we do things up here. You can't ask members of Congress to live under the same laws as everybody else. You can't expect the government to ever reduce spending. And I just refuse to accept that. So I don't want to be somebody who's up here just adopting the Washington consensus, because I think that that's failed us over a number of years. And so I want to offer a reform agenda that really puts people first, that tries to empower citizens instead of constantly empowering government to tax more and spend more. But I appreciate the question. Good question. Well, if you have inflation and you have money in the bank, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, that money that you put in is not going to be worth as much if you have high rates of inflation. And so in that sense, it's better for somebody to consume rather than to save in that environment. Who is high inflation good for? Indebted governments. And so you have some people who say that we should try to essentially, quote, monetize the debt, have inflation so that the debt that we have in this country is easier to pay off. I don't support that at all, because I think that actually kills people who've worked hard and saved and done the responsible thing, particularly a lot of our senior citizens who are living on a fixed income. The inflation really eats at their purchasing power and reduces their standard of living. For me, it's more important to vote by principle, because the whole reason political parties exist in theory are to be a mechanism to advance different principles that are important not only to the person who's in office, but to that individual's constituents back in their districts. And so when you start putting party for the sake of party, it's all about acquiring and maintaining power in that instance. And to me, I think that there's way too much of that in Washington. Put forward your principles, be consistent with what you said you would do, and let the chips fall where they may. If it helps your party, great. If it doesn't, it's still your responsibility to do what you think is the right thing. But those are both very good questions.